The autumn wind of 1889 swept across Sweetwater County like a harbinger of change, carrying dust and dried sage through the streets of the small Wyoming town. In the Red Butte saloon, smoke from oil lamps mixed with the stench of horse sweat and cheap whiskey, creating a haze that hung over the card tables like morning fog over the prairie. Caleb Hart sat hunched over his cards, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he studied his losing hand. The cowboy's sun-beaten face, carved by 32 years of hard living, betrayed nothing of the panic rising in his chest. Across from him, Duke Fallon leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his thin mouth. "Well now, Hart," Duke drawled, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Seems Lady Luck ain't favoring you tonight." He laid down his cards with a theatrical flourish, a full house. Kings over tens. The laughter that erupted from Duke's men was sharp as broken glass. Caleb's jaw tightened as he threw down his pair of sevens, the cards scattering across the scarred wooden table. He'd been so sure, so damn sure that this hand would turn his fortunes around. Instead, he'd lost everything: his savings, his horse, even the deed to his small homestead on the edge of town. Duke pulled out a piece of paper, already prepared, and slid it across the table. "Now, about that debt you owe me." Caleb's eyes scanned the document, his blood running cold. The sum was more than he could hope to repay in 3 lifetimes of honest work. "Duke, I need time." "Time?" Duke's laugh was devoid of humor. "You've had time, Hart, but I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to offer you a, shall we say, alternative arrangement." From the kitchen doorway, Lila Brooks watched the scene unfold, her dark eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts. She'd been working in Duke's establishment for 2 years now, bound by a contract that was barely a step above slavery. Her hands, roughened by endless hours of cooking and cleaning, gripped the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the evening stew. Duke gestured toward her with his cigar. "Miss Brooks here has been a faithful employee, but I find myself in need of legitimizing certain arrangements. You marry her, take on her contract as your responsibility, and we'll call your debt square." The saloon fell silent except for the crackle of the wood stove. Caleb's gaze met Lila's across the smoky room. She stood straight-backed despite her exhaustion, her dignity intact despite the grease stains on her apron and the weariness etched in the lines around her eyes. That ain't right, Duke," Caleb managed, his voice hoarse. "Right." Duke stood, his hand moving to rest casually on the pistol at his hip. "What ain't right is a man gambling what he can't afford to lose. What ain't right is leaving debts unpaid. I'm offering you a way out. Hart, take it or lose everything." Caleb's fist connected with the wooden post beside him, splinters digging into his knuckles. The sharp pain brought clarity. He'd done this to himself. Let his weakness for cards cloud his judgment once again. Now, an innocent woman would pay the price for his foolishness. But maybe he could protect her. Marriage would transfer her contract to him, and he could set her free once they were away from Duke's reach. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than the alternatives Duke might have in mind. "I'll do it," Caleb said quietly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the decision. Lila's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or resignation. She'd survived 2 years under Duke's thumb by being smart, by choosing her battles. This might be her chance at something better, even if it meant binding herself to a stranger. "I accept," she said, her voice carrying across the room with surprising strength. The men at the bar exchanged glances, some snickering, others looking away uncomfortably. Duke clapped his hands together. "Excellent. No time like the present. Reverend Thompson still awake? I saw lamplight in the chapel when I passed by earlier." The walk to the small wooden chapel at the edge of town felt like a funeral procession. Caleb and Lila walked side by side, but not touching, Duke and 2 of his men following close behind. The autumn wind whipped at Lila's skirts and sent tumbleweeds skittering across their path like frightened animals. Reverend Thompson, a bent old man with kind eyes, answered the door in his nightshirt. His face fell when he saw Duke, but he nodded slowly when the situation was explained. "I'll perform the ceremony," he said quietly, "but only if both parties consent freely before God." In the dim light of the chapel, illuminated by a single oil lamp, the Reverend asked the question. Lila looked at Caleb, really looked at him for the first time. She saw a man drowning in shame, but also one who'd chosen the harder path when he could have simply run. Maybe there was something to work with there. "I consent," she said. Caleb met her gaze, seeing strength where he'd expected fear, dignity where he'd expected desperation. "I consent," he echoed. The ceremony was brief, witnessed by Duke's sneering men and sealed with 2 rings hastily woven from strips of leather all they had on hand. As they spoke their vows, the only sounds were the whisper of wind through the chapel walls and the distant cry of coyotes on the prairie. On the wagon ride to Caleb's homestead, the silence stretched between them like the vast Wyoming sky. Finally, as the lights of town faded behind them, Caleb spoke. "I want you to know," he said, keeping his eyes on the reins. "This marriage, it don't mean you owe me anything, not your body, not your servitude. We survived this winter together, that's all. Come spring, if you want to leave, I won't stop you." Lila studied his profile in the moonlight. "And until then, we're partners, equal partners. My home is your home, such as it is." She considered this, weighing his words against every promise she'd heard from men before. "I choose safety and my dignity. Mr. Hart, grant me those, and I'll work alongside you fair and square." "Caleb," he corrected softly, "and you have my word." The homestead appeared before them, a small cabin with a lean-to barn, surrounded by sagebrush and buffalo grass bending in the wind. It wasn't much, but the sight of it made something ease in Lila's chest. No Duke Fallon here, no leering customers or groping hands, just the vast prairie and a chance to breathe. Inside, Caleb immediately set about making a separate sleeping space for her, stringing up a blanket for privacy and offering her the better of his 2 quilts. Lila examined the cast-iron stove, coaxing it to life with practiced hands. Soon, the smell of roasting cornmeal filled the small space her way of christening this new beginning. As they settled in for their first night under the same roof, separated by the makeshift curtain but united by circumstance, both lay awake thinking. The wind howled outside, and somewhere in the distance, wolves called to each other across the empty plains. Caleb stared at the rough wooden ceiling, shame burning in his gut. He'd sworn after losing the farm back in Missouri that he'd never gamble again. Yet here he was, having wagered not just his own future but that of an innocent woman. He vowed silently that this would be his last mistake of that kind. On the other side of the blanket, Lila listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night. She'd been prepared for the worst when Caleb won her in that devil's bargain. But his restraint, his offer of partnership rather than ownership, had surprised her. Maybe, just maybe, she'd found a situation where she could build something real. The oil lamp flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. Outside, the Wyoming wind continued its lonely song, carrying with it the promise of hard times ahead. Winter was coming, and with it would come tests that would either break them apart or forge them into something stronger than either could be alone. The first morning arrived with frost painting the water trough in delicate crystals. Caleb woke before dawn, his breath visible in the cold air of the cabin. Through the blanket partition, he could hear Lila already moving about, the soft rustle of fabric and the scrape of the stove grate being cleaned. He dressed quickly and stepped outside to split wood, the axe biting into pine logs with rhythmic precision. The physical work helped clear his head, each swing a small penance for his foolishness. When he turned back toward the cabin, he found Lila at the chicken coop, examining the few scrawny hens with a practiced eye. "Morning," he called out, his voice rough from the cold. She nodded in acknowledgement, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "These birds are half-starved. We'll be lucky to get 2 eggs a week from the lot of them." "I know it ain't much." "I've worked with less," she interrupted, not unkindly. "There's potential here. Mr. Hart just needs proper tending." Over a meager breakfast of cornmeal mush and weak coffee, they established what Lila called house rules. The conversation was businesslike, both of them treating it as a negotiation between equals rather than a discussion between husband and wife. "We split the work fare," Lila stated, her hands wrapped around her tin cup for warmth. "I'll handle the cooking and the chickens, help with the garden come spring. You manage the heavier labor and any livestock." Caleb nodded. "Money's tight. What little I got is in that chest by the door. You need something, you take it. No asking permission." Her eyebrows rose slightly at that. In her experience, men guarded their money like dragons guarded gold. And decisions about the homestead, we discussed them together. Both got to agree before any major changes. They shook hands across the rough wooden table, a business partnership sealed with calloused palms and mutual respect. Later that morning, Caleb showed her around the property boundaries. The land was harsh 40 acres of scrubland dotted with white alkali patches that made farming difficult. A creek ran through the eastern corner, though it was barely more than a trickle this late in the season. "It ain't paradise," Caleb admitted, kicking at a clump of dry grass. "Soil's mean, water's scarce. Takes stubbornness more than skill to make anything grow out here." Lila surprised him by kneeling down and scooping up a handful of earth, letting it run through her fingers. "My father farmed along the Kansas River before the railroad came through. He used to say the land teaches you patience if you're willing to learn." "Your father, is he—" "Gone. 10 years now." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Caleb caught the tightening around her eyes. "Learned everything I could from him before fever took him. My mother passed shortly after." They continued the tour in companionable silence, both recognizing a shared understanding of loss without needing to voice it. The trip to town that afternoon was Caleb's first real test of his resolve. As their wagon rolled down Main Street, he could feel the eyes following them, some curious, some contemptuous, all judging. Whispers trailed in their wake like dust. At Morrison's general store, Mrs. Morrison's smile faltered when she saw Lila enter behind Caleb. The temperature in the store seemed to drop several degrees. "Mr. Hart," she said stiffly, her eyes sliding past Lila as if she wasn't there. "Heard about your situation." "My wife and I need supplies for winter," Caleb said firmly, emphasizing the word wife. "Salt, flour, nails for repairs." Lila moved through the store with quiet dignity, selecting items with careful consideration of their limited funds, when a group of women near the fabric counter began whispering and pointing. She held her head higher and continued her shopping. At the counter, Mrs. Morrison tallied their purchases with pursed lips, when she quoted a price nearly double what Caleb knew things should cost. Lila spoke up for the first time. "That's interesting," she said mildly, her voice carrying the kind of steel wrapped in silk. "I helped Mrs. Patterson purchase those exact nails last week at Duke's establishment. They were half that price." "Mrs. Morrison's face flushed. After a moment's hesitation, she adjusted the price to something more reasonable. As they loaded their supplies, Caleb caught Lila's eye. The tiny smile she gave him was worth more than gold. On the ride home, Caleb finally asked, "How'd you know about the nail prices?" "I kept Duke's books when he was too drunk to count straight," she replied. "Man never knew I could read and figure. Seemed wise to keep it that way." That evening, as they worked together to repair a section of fence before the weather turned worse, Caleb found himself impressed by her knowledge of knots. She tied the wire with quick, sure movements that spoke of long practice. "Sailor's hitch," she explained when he commented. Learned it from an old boatman on the Missouri. Holds tight but comes loose when you need it to. The days settled into a rhythm. Morning chores, afternoon repairs, evening meals eaten by lamplight. They were careful with each other, maintaining boundaries while slowly learning to work as a team. When Lila came down with a persistent cough after a particularly cold night, Caleb boiled water with wild sage leaves, a remedy his mother had taught him years ago. "Drink it slow," he advised, setting the cup before her. "Tastes like the devil's boot heel, but it'll ease your throat." She sipped the bitter brew without complaint, and in the quiet that followed, told him fragments of her past, the railroad camps where she'd cooked for work crews, the times she'd had to run from men who saw a young black woman alone as easy prey, the skills she'd gathered like armor along the way. Their first real disagreement came when Caleb proposed selling his father's Winchester to pay down some of Duke's interest. Lila set down her mending with a sharp movement. "That's foolishness talking," she said bluntly. "You sell that rifle, we're left defenseless out here." "We need the money. We need protection more. Sell the extra saddle if you must. That fancy bit you never use, but not the gun." They argued back and forth, voices rising but never crossing into disrespect. Finally, they compromised: sell the decorative items, keep the necessities. It was Lila who suggested she keep track of their finances in a proper ledger. "I've got a head for numbers," she said simply. "Might as well use it." Caleb agreed, and handed over the key to the money chest without hesitation. The trust implicit in that gesture wasn't lost on either of them. One evening, as a storm built on the horizon, Lila taught Caleb a song she'd learned on the Mississippi, a slow, mournful tune that seemed to match the rhythm of the wind. Their voices, his rough baritone and her warm alto, blended in the small cabin as rain began to patter against the windows. When the song ended, Caleb found himself sharing something he'd told no one since leaving Missouri. "I had a brother, Samuel. Lost him in a sandstorm when he was just 14. I was supposed to be watching him." Lila didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, she simply said, "The weight of that must be considerable." "It is," he admitted, staring into the fire. "Started gambling after that. Thought if I could just win enough, make enough money, it would somehow, I don't know, make up for it." And now, he met her eyes across the dim cabin. "Now I know better. Can't gamble your way out of grief. Just makes more of it." The storm intensified outside, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The space between them, while still respectful of boundaries, had warmed somehow. When Caleb made his pallet by the stove that night, Lila spoke from behind her curtain. "That tea you made helped. Thank you." "You're welcome," he replied, and meant it more than she could know. As the days grew shorter and colder, they prepared for winter with increasing urgency. Every task was shared, every decision discussed. Trust built slowly, like stones placed carefully for a foundation. Neither spoke of love or affection. It was too soon for that, too fragile. But respect was there, growing stronger with each passing day. When the first snow began to fall in late November, they stood together on the porch, watching the flakes drift down like prayers made visible. Their breath mingled in the cold air, and though they didn't touch, the space between them felt less like a chasm and more like a bridge waiting to be built. "Winter's here," Caleb observed unnecessarily. "We're ready," Lila replied, and for the first time since that night in Duke's saloon, both of them believed it might be true. The rumors spread through Sweetwater like wildfire through dry grass. Cowboy lost a bet. Forced to wed a black beauty, he discovered the wife of his dreams. The gossips whispered, though their tone suggested mockery rather than romance. The words reached Lila's ears at the blacksmith's shop where she'd gone to inquire about mending a broken hinge. She kept her expression neutral, but Caleb saw the slight tightening of her jaw when she returned home. He'd heard the same whispers at the feed store, delivered with snickers and knowing looks that made his fists clench. Don't let them get under your skin, Lila said quietly as she unpacked the few supplies they could afford. Words are just air unless we give them weight. But words had consequences in a small town. The next morning, young Ben Wheeler, the blacksmith's apprentice, appeared at their gate. He shifted nervously from foot to foot, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. "Mrs. Hart," he said, removing his cap and crushing it between his hands. I wanted to apologize for what was said in the shop yesterday. Wasn't right." Lila studied him for a moment, then offered a small smile. "Thank you, Ben. Would you like some water? You've written a fair piece." The young man's relief was palpable. As she drew water from the well, Caleb noticed how her simple kindness had transformed the boy's expression from shame to something approaching hope. It was a small bridge, but a bridge nonetheless. That afternoon brought less welcome visitors. 2 of Duke's men appeared at their property line, their horses kicking up dust as they surveyed the homestead with calculating eyes. "Duke sends his regards." One of them called out, his grin sharp as a knife. "Wants to remind you that winter's coming, and accidents happen when folks can't pay their debts." "The debt was settled," Caleb said firmly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped by the door. "Duke's got a different recollection. Says there's interest accumulating. Figured you might want to contribute some supplies to show good faith. Wood, maybe. Food." Lila appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her presence was calm, but Caleb could see the steel in her spine. "Mr. Fallon received exactly what was agreed upon. We have the papers to prove it." The men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting her to speak up. "Papers can be disputed, Missy." "Not in a court of law," she replied evenly. "And certainly not by men who can't even deliver a threat properly. Tell Duke we appreciate his concern for our welfare, but we're managing just fine." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Finally, the men wheeled their horses around and rode off, but not before one of them spat in the dirt a clear message that this wasn't over. That evening, as they discussed reinforcing their defenses, a soft knock came at the door. Caleb opened it cautiously to find Mrs. Eliza Garrett, the widow who lived 2 miles east. She held a covered basket in her weathered hands. "Brought some cornbread," she said brusquely, as if daring them to question her motives. "Made too much, and it don't keep well." The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on any of them. In a town where taking sides could have consequences, Mrs. Garrett had just declared where she stood. "Would you come in for coffee?" Lila offered. The older woman hesitated, then nodded. As they sat around the table, she told them about her late husband, about raising 3 children alone on the frontier, about the winters that tested faith and the springs that restored it. "Folks in town got short memories," she said, fixing Caleb with a steady gaze. "They forget we all came here running from something or towards something. Difference between good folks and bad ain't the color of their skin or the circumstances of their meeting. It's what they do when times get hard." After she left, Lila stood at the window watching her wagon disappear into the dusk. "One ally?" she said softly. "It's a start," Caleb agreed. The next morning brought trouble in a different form. A group of children, egged on by their parents' prejudices, had gathered at the edge of their property. Rocks began flying, along with words no child should know. Caleb stormed out, his face dark with anger. "You kids get on home before I die." "Before you what?" The voice belonged to Harold Mason, one of Duke's regular customers. He stood behind the children, arms crossed. "They're just having some fun." "Throwing rocks at my wife isn't fun," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's cowardice." The confrontation might have escalated, but Mrs. Garrett appeared with her shotgun cradled in her arms. "Harold Mason, you get those children away from here before I tell the whole town about what I saw you doing behind the saloon last Tuesday." Harold's face went pale, and he quickly herded the children away. "Mrs. Garrett gave Caleb and Lila a firm nod before heading back to her wagon. That night, as Lila tended to a small cut on her hand from one of the thrown rocks, she surprised Caleb with a story. "My grandmother was born into slavery in Georgia," she said, carefully cleaning the wound. "When she finally got her freedom, she chose the name Brooks because she said freedom flowed like water, can't stop it, can't chain it, can only try to direct it, but water always finds a way." Caleb watched her efficient movements, the quiet strength in her hands. "My mother was a seamstress," he offered in return. "Taught me to mend my own clothes," said a man who couldn't tend to himself, couldn't tend to others. "Used to make me practice stitches on old flour sacks until they were near perfect." "A useful skill," Lila observed, a hint of warmth in her voice. As winter pressed closer, the atmosphere in town grew heavier. Some folks, like Ben Wheeler and Mrs. Garrett, made quiet gestures of support. Ben often found reasons to stop by, offering to help with repairs in exchange for a meal. But others grew bolder in their hostility, emboldened by Duke's obvious displeasure with the situation. One afternoon at the general store, Lila overheard two women discussing that unfortunate heart situation. "Imagine being forced to live with one of them," one woman said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The poor man must be beside himself." Lila set down her basket with deliberate calm and approached the women. "The poor man," she said clearly. "He is at home fixing our roof so we don't freeze this winter. He's a good man who made a mistake and is working to set it right, which is more than I can say for folks who've got nothing better to do than spread poison with their gossip." The women fled, but Lila knew she'd made enemies. Still, she held her head high as she completed her shopping, even when the storekeeper overcharged her again. That evening, Caleb surprised her with a proposal. "Been thinking," he said over dinner. "What if we started a soup kitchen one day a week for folks who are struggling? Winter's going to be hard on everyone." Lila looked up sharply. "That would cost supplies we barely have." "I know, but Mrs. Garrett mentioned several families who are worse off than us. If we could just do something small." She considered this, absently stirring her spoon in her bowl. "It would show the town we're here to be part of the community, not apart from it." "That too," Caleb admitted. "But mostly it's the right thing to do." They agreed to try it, starting small. The first week, only Mrs. Garrett and Ben showed up, more to help than to eat. But the second week brought a young mother with 2 children. And by the third, they had a dozen people sharing thin but hot soup and whatever bread Lila could manage to bake. It was during one of these gatherings that the mood in town began to shift, almost imperceptibly. People saw Lila teaching a young girl to read while her mother ate. They watched Caleb patiently showing a group of boys how to mend harnesses. They witnessed small kindnesses that spoke louder than rumors. Not everyone was won over. Duke's influence ran deep, and there were those who would never accept what they saw as a violation of the natural order. But cracks appeared in the wall of prejudice, tiny fissures that might, given time, grow wider. One cold evening, as freezing rain pelted the roof, Lila slipped on the ice-slicked porch. Caleb caught her arm instinctively, steadying her. For a moment, they stood close, his hand on her elbow, her hand gripping his shoulder. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, not quite affection, not yet, but a recognition of something that might grow if given the chance. "Thank you," she said softly. "Always," he replied, and meant it. They stepped apart, but the warmth of that brief contact lingered. That night, as they worked together to patch a leak in the roof, their movements were coordinated without words. 2 people learning the rhythm of partnership. Before bed, they established new rules boundaries that protected while allowing for the gradual building of trust. If either felt uncomfortable, they would speak up immediately. If either needed space, it would be given without question. They were building something together, stone by stone, and neither wanted to risk the foundation they'd laid. The winter wind howled outside, and somewhere in the darkness, they knew Duke Fallon was planning his next move. But inside the small cabin, warmed by the stove and the growing understanding between them, Caleb and Lila Hart were discovering that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings could lead to the strongest bonds. The ice came in the dead of night, transforming the Wyoming landscape into a crystalline battlefield. Wolves, driven by hunger, circled the Weatherby homestead 3 miles north, their howls carrying on the frozen wind. Caleb woke to the sound of their neighbor Tom Weatherby pounding on their door. "Hart, need help. The wolves got into my sheep pen." Without hesitation, Caleb grabbed his rifle and a torch. Lila was already up, pulling on her heaviest shawl. "I'm coming too," she said, brooking no argument. They rode through the bitter darkness, torches held high, the flames casting dancing shadows on the ice-covered ground. At the Weatherby place, chaos reigned. Sheep bleated in terror as dark shapes circled the broken fence. Tom's wife, Sarah, stood on the porch with a shotgun, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Take the east side," Caleb shouted to Tom, spurring his horse forward. The wolves scattered at their approach, but regrouped quickly, hunger making them bold. Lila dismounted near the pen, using her torch to create a barrier of light while she helped Sarah herd the surviving sheep into the barn. A wolf lunged at the stragglers, and without thinking, Lila swung the torch in a wide arc, driving it back. The battle lasted until dawn, neighbors arriving one by one to help drive off the pack. When the sun finally rose, painting the ice-covered prairie in shades of pink and gold, they counted their losses 5 sheep dead. But it could have been worse. "Thank you," Sarah Weatherby said, gripping Lila's hands. "Both of you." Back home, exhausted and cold, they discovered fresh horse tracks around their own cattle pen. Caleb knelt to examine them, his jaw tightening. "These aren't from last night. Someone's been scouting." Lila studied the tracks with a practiced eye. 3 riders, maybe 4. They circled twice, stopped here by the gate. She pointed to where someone had tested the latch. "We need better security." They spent the afternoon rigging a warning system, small bells attached to wire around the fence posts. It was Lila's idea, remembered from her days in the railroad camps where theft was common. "If someone touches the fence, we'll hear it," she explained, demonstrating how the slightest pressure set the bells ringing. That night, their precautions proved wise. The bells chimed softly at first, then more insistently. Caleb rolled out of bed, rifle in hand, while Lila positioned herself at the window with the shotgun. 2 figures were at the cattle pen, working on the gate. Caleb burst out the door, shouting a warning. A rock caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but he kept his feet. One intruder fled immediately, but the other got tangled in their wire system. Lila emerged from the cabin, shotgun trained on the trapped man. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The trapped intruder cursed and struggled, finally going still when he realized escape was impossible. In the moonlight, they recognized him Jake Morrison, one of Duke's regular hired hands. "This is a mistake," Jake sputtered. "I was just—" "Stealing cattle is a hanging offense in Wyoming territory," Lila interrupted calmly. "Though I suspect Duke didn't mention that when he sent you here." They tied Jake securely and loaded him into the wagon as dawn broke. The ride to town was tense, Caleb nursing his bruised shoulder while Lila kept watch for ambush. At the sheriff's office, they found Sheriff Watson reluctant to act. "Now, folks," the sheriff said, not meeting their eyes. "Jake here says it's all a misunderstanding. Says he was drunk, got lost. He was stone sober and knew exactly where he was," Caleb said flatly. "We've got a right to protection under the law, Sheriff." Watson shifted uncomfortably. Duke Fallon's influence was like a shadow over the office, unspoken but undeniable. It was Lila who broke the stalemate. "Sheriff Watson," she said, stepping forward. "I believe you're familiar with Territorial Statute 14, Section 3, the one that states any law officer who fails to investigate credible reports of livestock theft can be removed from office by citizen petition." The sheriff's face reddened. "Now, see here. We have witnesses," she continued calmly. "Ben Wheeler saw the riders heading toward our property. Mrs. Garrett can testify to seeing Jake Morrison near our fence line yesterday. Would you prefer to do your job? Or shall we start gathering signatures?" Watson caved, reluctantly locking Jake in the single cell. As they left, Caleb marveled at Lila's knowledge of the law. Railroad camps had their share of legal troubles. She explained, "I learned to read law books when I could find them. Knowledge is armor. Caleb, sometimes it's the only armor we've got." That evening, Duke Fallon himself appeared at the Red Butte Saloon, holding court as usual. Word of Jake's arrest had spread, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. When Caleb and Lila entered, they'd come to town for supplies and refused to be driven into hiding conversation, stopped. Duke smiled, all teeth and no warmth. "Well, if it isn't the happy couple. Heard you had some trouble last night." "Trouble that's now sitting in a jail cell," Caleb replied evenly. "Misunderstanding happen," Duke said, examining his fingernails. "Course, misunderstandings can escalate. Property can burn, stock can disappear. Accidents happen on the frontier." Lila stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the silent saloon. "Mr. Fallon, are you threatening us in front of all these witnesses?" Duke's eyes narrowed. "Just observing the harsh realities of frontier life, Mrs. Hart." "Then let me share an observation of my own," Lila said. "Justice is like water, it finds its level. You can dam it up for a while, but eventually it breaks through, and when it does, it sweeps away everything in its path." The saloon remained dead silent for a long moment. Then Ben Wheeler started clapping, slowly and deliberately. "Mrs." Garrett joined him, then Tom Weatherby. Not everyone many still feared Duke's retribution, but enough to make a statement. Duke's face darkened like a thundercloud. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "We'll see about that," he said, and stalked out. That night, back at the homestead, Caleb finally voiced what had been building inside him for weeks. "I need you to know something," he said, staring into the fire. "I was a coward before, not just with the gambling, but with everything. When Sam died, I ran from the farm, from my family's disappointment, from facing what I'd done." Lila listened quietly, letting him speak. "I don't want to run anymore," he continued. "But I need you to know if I fail again, if I turn coward when things get worse, you don't owe me anything. You get yourself safe. Understand?" She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I've been running too. In my way, running from place to place, never settling, never trusting. Maybe we both need to learn how to stand our ground." They practiced shooting the next morning, setting up targets behind the house. Lila's aim was impressive. She could hit a can at 50 paces consistently. She taught Caleb her technique: breathe out slow, squeeze gentle like you're pressing a secret into the earth. The gun's just a tool. Your mind does the aiming. As winter deepened, they found themselves sharing more in the evening hours. Caleb told her about Sam, how he'd been the smarter one, the one who could make their mother laugh, the one who should have lived. Lila shared her own losses, the way her father's hands shook from fever at the end, how her mother had simply faded away after, like a flower deprived of sun. One night, as snow began to fall, they sat closer to the fire than usual. The warmth between them had been building for weeks, unspoken but undeniable. When their hands brushed reaching for the coffee pot, neither pulled away. "Lila," Caleb said softly. "I know," she replied, "but we need to be sure, both of us, This has to be choice, not circumstance. He nodded, respecting the boundary even as something in his chest ached. When you're ready, if you're ever ready. You'll know, she finished. They pulled apart, but the air between them had changed, charged with possibility. Outside, the snow fell heavier, and somewhere in the darkness, they knew Duke was planning his next move. But inside their small cabin, something was growing: trust deepening into affection, partnership evolving into something more. The bells on the fence chimed softly in the wind, a reminder that danger was never far away. But for now, in the circle of firelight, they had created something worth defending, a home built not on debt or obligation, but on mutual respect and the slow, careful construction of love. The blizzard struck without mercy, transforming the Wyoming prairie into a howling white void. The wind screamed like a living thing, driving snow horizontal across the landscape. Inside the cabin, Caleb and Lila worked frantically to seal every crack, stuffing rags into gaps and nailing blankets over the windows. "This is worse than anything I've seen," Caleb shouted over the wind as he secured the last board. Ice already formed on his beard from the brief exposure to the door. They strung a rope between the cabin and the barn, knowing that in whiteout conditions, a man could lose his way in 10 feet and freeze to death in his own yard. Lila wrapped cloth around the horses' legs while Caleb checked their feed. Every movement was deliberate. Economical: waste no energy, make no mistakes. Inside, they rationed everything. The woodpile, substantial in autumn, now seemed pitifully small against the storm's fury. Lila divided their food stores with mathematical precision, calculating how many days they could last if the storm continued. "Beans and bone soup," she announced, stirring the pot. "We stretch everything, no seconds, no matter how hungry." Caleb noticed she served him a larger portion and pushed half back into her bowl. "Equal shares," he said firmly. "We survive together or not at all." She met his eyes, saw the determination there, and nodded. On the third night, Caleb's fever struck. He'd been hiding his exhaustion, but his body finally rebelled. Lila found him collapsed by the stove, burning hot despite the cold, mumbling incoherently about sandstorms and lost brothers. She dragged him to his bed, piling every blanket they owned on top of him. Through the night, she bathed his face with cool water, spooning willow bark tea between his cracked lips when he'd take it. He thrashed and called out for Sam, apologizing to ghosts only he could see. "Should have held the rope tighter. Sam, don't go into the storm. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Lila held his hand, speaking softly. "You're here, Caleb. You're safe. Stay with me." When his fever finally broke near dawn, he found her still beside him, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. As consciousness returned, so did the memory of his ravings. The tears came, then years of guilt and grief pouring out in great, shuddering sobs. Lila didn't try to stop him or offer empty comfort. She simply held his hand and let him grieve, understanding that sometimes the greatest kindness is allowing someone their pain. When the storm finally exhausted itself 5 days later, they emerged to a transformed world. Snow drifted higher than the windows in places, turning familiar landmarks into alien shapes. The silence after so much noise was almost painful. They dug out slowly, checking on the animals first. 2 chickens had frozen despite their precautions, but the horses and remaining cattle had survived. Every small victory mattered now. "Look," Lila said, pointing to tracks in the snow. A rabbit had passed by, leaving delicate prints. "Life goes on." They worked side by side, clearing paths, their breath steaming in the bitter air. When Caleb's strength flagged, he was still weak from the fever. Lila took the shovel without comment and continued. Pride had no place in survival. That evening, huddled close to the stove, they shared dreams like rations, small portions to sustain hope. "A proper well," Caleb said. Deep enough that it won't go dry in summer. Glass windows, Lila added. Real ones that let in light. Books, they said together, then smiled the first real smiles in days. My father had 3 books, Lila continued. The Bible, obviously, a medical text from his army days, and a volume of poetry Wordsworth. He'd read to us by candlelight, even when we could barely afford the candles. What happened to them? Sold, after he died. Books don't fill stomachs. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Caleb heard the loss beneath it. We'll have books, he promised. A whole shelf of them. The quiet that followed was comfortable. Not the tense silence of their early days, but something warmer. When Lila shivered, Caleb hesitated, then opened his arm in invitation. She considered for a moment before moving closer, fitting against his side like she belonged there. Is this all right? He asked softly. Yes, she said, and felt him relax. They stayed that way as the fire burned low, sharing warmth and something more. A growing certainty that what had started as a devil's bargain was becoming something neither had dared hope for. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Ben Wheeler arrived on horseback, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. Mrs. Garrett sent these, he said, unloading sacks of flour and dried beans. Said to tell you the soup kitchen folks took up a collection. Figured you'd need it after the storm. Lila's eyes misted, though she'd blame it on the cold. Tell them thank you. Tell them yourself. Ben grinned. Soon as the road's clear, they're planning a barn raising. Tom Weatherby lost his to the snow weight. Figured while folks are building, might as well put up that addition you mentioned wanting. After he left, Caleb found Lila crying quietly by the window. Hey, he said gently. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, she said, wiping her eyes. It's just, I've been alone so long, having people care if we live or die. I'd forgotten what that felt like. He understood. The frontier was hard on everyone, but it was especially cruel to those who faced it alone. You're not alone anymore, he said simply. Neither of us is. That night, as they prepared for bed, Lila made a decision. Instead of going to her curtained corner, she paused by Caleb's bed. The curtain's not keeping out the cold anymore, she said carefully. Would it be all right if... Lila, he sat up, meeting her eyes. I made you a promise. Nothing's changed about that. You're safe with me. She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face. I know, that's why I'm asking. They shared the bed that night, carefully, respectfully, with space between them but less than before. It was about warmth. Yes, but also about trust, the kind that's earned through fevered nights and rationed meals and promises kept when keeping them is hard. Outside, the Wyoming winter continued its assault on the living. But inside the small cabin, something bloomed despite the cold, a love built not on passion but on patience. Not on words but on actions. Not on taking but on giving. When Duke Fallon made his next move, they would be ready. Not because they were strong alone, but because they had learned the secret that had built the frontier that 2 people, standing together, could weather storms that would destroy them separately. The rope they'd strung to the barn remained even after the snow melted, a reminder that in the darkest times, what saves you is often the lifeline you've made with your own hands and the person beside you who makes sure you don't let go. The night sky glowed orange, and the acrid smell of burning pine tar jolted Caleb from sleep. He leaped from bed, Lila already beside him, both racing to the window. Their barn was engulfed in flames, the fire eating through the wooden structure with terrifying speed. "The horses!" Lila cried, already pulling on her boots. They burst out into the night, the heat hitting them like a physical wall. The cattle in the nearby pen bellowed in terror, pressing against the far fence. Inside the barn, they could hear their horses screaming. Caleb plunged into the inferno without hesitation. The smoke was thick, disorienting, but he knew every inch of this barn. He found Jupiter, his best horse, rearing in panic, and managed to cut the rope. The animal bolted for the door, nearly trampling him in its terror. He turned back for the others, but a beam crashed down, showering sparks. Through the smoke, he saw Lila at the other end, leading out the mare. "Get out!" she shouted over the roar of flames. Not without, the roof began to groan ominously. Lila grabbed his arm with surprising strength, hauling him toward the door. They stumbled out together just as the roof collapsed, sending a column of fire and sparks into the night sky. They fell to their knees in the snow, coughing, faces black with soot. Jupiter lay still near the corral, overcome by smoke. The loss hit Caleb like a physical blow. That horse had been with him for 6 years. Through everything. "I'm sorry," Lila whispered, her hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry." He pulled her close, both of them shaking from more than cold. Around them, neighbors began arriving, drawn by the glow against the sky. Ben Wheeler came running with buckets, though they all knew it was too late. The barn was gone. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins, they found what Caleb had feared: boot prints in the mud. 3 sets, and the distinctive heel mark that Jake Morrison favored. Ben documented everything while Mrs. Garrett wrapped blankets around Lila's shoulders. "This is escalation," Tom Weatherby said grimly. "Duke's getting desperate." Word spread quickly through the community. By noon, a dozen people had gathered at the homestead, some bringing food, others lumber salvaged from their own supplies. The barn-raising plan for the Weatherbys would have to wait. The Harts needed shelter for their remaining animals first. The sheriff arrived in the afternoon, his face grave. "I'll need evidence," he said, though everyone could see the boot prints plain as day. "How much evidence do you need?" "Sheriff..." "Mrs." Garrett demanded. "First the cattle rustling, now arson. What's next? Murder." Sheriff Watson shifted uncomfortably. "Now, let's not jump to conclusions." "The only conclusion," Lila interrupted, her voice steady despite her exhaustion, "is that the law in this town serves only those who pay for it." The crowd murmured agreement, and Watson reddened. "I'll investigate," he said stiffly, "but accusations without proof." "We have proof," Ben said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at the young blacksmith. "I saw them, Duke's men, riding hard away from here last night, just before the fire started. Thought they were drunk, heading home from the saloon. But..." "Will you testify to that?" Caleb asked. Ben swallowed hard but nodded. "It ain't right. What they're doing, none of it's right." That evening, an envelope appeared under their door. Lila opened it carefully, reading the words aloud. "Leave now, or burn with the next one." Caleb crumpled the paper in his fist. "That's it. I'm going to..." "You're going to what?" Lila asked calmly. "Ride into town and challenge Duke. That's what he wants. You dead or in jail. Me defenseless." "Then what do we do?" "We build," she said firmly. "We rebuild, and we show them they can't break us. And we document everything, every threat, every incident. We build a case that even a bought sheriff can't ignore." They worked through their grief and anger, channeling it into construction. The community responded with overwhelming support. The soup kitchen families, people they'd fed during the hard times, showed up with hammers and nails. Even some who'd been hostile before came to help. Shame finally outweighing prejudice. During a break in the work, Reverend Thompson pulled Lila aside. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about the night Duke brought you both to my chapel. I knew it was wrong. Performing a ceremony under duress. I've written a letter to the territorial authorities about it. My conscience won't let me stay silent anymore." Lila squeezed his weathered hand. "What's done is done. Reverend, Caleb and we've found something real despite how it started. Maybe because of how it started. Sometimes the worst circumstances forge the strongest bonds." As the new structure rose from the ashes, smaller but sturdy, Caleb worked with fevered intensity. Lila finally pulled him aside as the sun set. "You're punishing yourself," she said softly. "For the horse, for the barn, for all of it." "I brought this on you," he said, not meeting her eyes. "My gambling, my debts." "Our life," she corrected firmly. "Our choice to stand against Duke. Our decision to stay and fight. Don't you dare take all the responsibility on yourself. I'm not some helpless victim. Caleb Hart, I'm your partner, and I choose to be here." That night, as they lay in bed together now by choice rather than necessity, Caleb finally gave voice to what had been growing between them. "Lila, I need to tell you something." "I know," she said softly. "You don't know. I need to say it." He turned to face her in the darkness. "I love you. Not because of the marriage certificate or the circumstances. I love your strength, your kindness, the way you see right through to the truth of things. I love—" She silenced him with a kiss, their first real kiss, gentle and sure. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "Despite everything, because of everything." They held each other as the wind rattled the windows, both aware that Duke's violence was escalating, that harder times were coming. But in that moment, they had something Duke could never understand, a love tested by fire and found true. The next morning brought news that Jake Morrison had been released on bail, paid by Duke himself. The man had been seen drinking and boasting about teaching uppity folks their place. One of the saloon girls, brave enough to speak to Ben privately, confirmed that Duke was planning something bigger. "We need to be ready," Caleb said, checking their ammunition. "We need allies," Lila countered. "Duke's power comes from fear and money. We fight him with community and law." They spent the day visiting neighbors, sharing what they knew, building a network of watchers. By evening, they'd established a signal system, lanterns in windows, bells for warnings. The frontier had always required people to band together against threats, and Duke Fallon had made himself a threat to them all. As they prepared for bed, Lila touched the rough wood of the new barn. "We'll paint it," she said. "When this is over, paint it red like a proper barn." "When this is over," Caleb agreed, pulling her close. "We'll do a lot of things." But first, they had to survive what was coming. And they would not because they were fearless, but because they'd found something worth fighting for in each other and the community that had embraced them despite everything. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles. But in the small cabin beneath them, two people who'd started as strangers forced together had become something more, a family, a force, a love story written in soot and snow and the stubborn refusal to break. The makeshift courtroom in Sweetwater's town hall buzzed with tension thick as summer honey. Every wooden chair was occupied, with more folks standing along the walls. The pot-bellied stove wheezed in the corner, fighting against the March chill that seeped through the thin walls. Judge Cornelius Baker, brought in from Cheyenne for the occasion, sat behind a table that usually served for town meetings. Jake Morrison slouched in a chair beside Duke Fallon's hired attorney, Mr. Silas Wentworth, a man whose reputation for twisting the law was as polished as his eastern boots. Lila sat straight-backed in the witness chair, her Sunday dress pressed and clean, her voice carrying clear across the room as she recounted the night of the fire. She spoke without dramatics, laying out facts like she was listing ingredients for bread precise, measured, undeniable. "I saw 3 men approach our property at approximately 10 o'clock. The moon was near full, and visibility was clear. I recognized Jake Morrison by his distinctive gait. He favors his left leg from an old injury. They carried what appeared to be torches." Wentworth rose, his smile sharp as a skinning knife. "Mrs. Hart, isn't it true that your marriage came about through, shall we say, unusual circumstances?" The room stirred, whispers rippling through the crowd. Lila's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My marriage has no bearing on whether our barn was deliberately burned," she replied evenly. But it speaks to credibility, doesn't it? Wentworth pressed. A woman who would enter into such an arrangement, who would trade herself for a man's gambling debts. Objection! The voice came not from the prosecutor, but from Caleb, who shot to his feet. That's not what happened, and you damn well know it. Judge Baker banged his gavel. Mr. Hart, you'll have your turn to speak. Sit down. Caleb remained standing. I'll speak now. Your Honor, yes, I gambled. Yes, I lost. And yes, Duke Fallon used that debt to force an arrangement on both of us. But what grew from that beginning is real and legal and has nothing to do with who burned our barn. He turned to face the packed courtroom. I'm not proud of how our marriage started, but I'm proud of my wife, who's shown more courage and dignity than most folks in this room. I'm proud of what we've built together, and I won't sit quiet while this snake oil lawyer tries to use our past to excuse arson. The room erupted. Some shouted agreement, others called for order. Mrs. Garrett's voice rose above the rest. Let him speak. We all know what Duke Fallon is. Judge Baker pounded his gavel repeatedly until quiet was restored. Mr. Hart, your passion is noted. Please be seated. Mrs. Hart, continue your testimony. Lila concluded her account with the same calm precision, then stepped down. Ben Wheeler took the stand next, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swore the oath. His testimony was brief but damning. He'd seen the three men riding hard from the direction of the Hart property, Jake Morrison clearly visible in the lead. And you're certain it was Morrison? The prosecutor asked. Dead certain. Known Jake since we were boys. He was laughing, shouting something about warming up the neighborhood. Wentworth's cross-examination was vicious, implying Ben was sweet on Lila, suggesting his testimony was motivated by jealousy. But Ben held firm, his honesty shining through the lawyer's insinuations. The parade of witnesses continued. Mrs. Garrett testified about the threatening note. Tom Weatherby confirmed the boot prints. Even Sheriff Watson, reluctant and sweating, admitted the evidence pointed toward arson. Then came the surprise witness, Sarah Weatherby's sister, Anna, who worked at the Red Butte Saloon, took the stand. Duke's face darkened as she was sworn in. I was serving drinks the night before the fire, Anna said, her voice trembling but determined. Mr. Fallon was holding court as usual. He'd been drinking heavy, talking loud about teaching lessons and showing what happens to those who don't know their place. This is hearsay, Wentworth began. Let her speak. Judge Baker ruled. Anna continued. Jake Morrison was there. Mr. Fallon gave him a pouch coins. From the sound, said something about making it hot for the Harts. Jake laughed and said he knew just what to do. The courtroom exploded again. Duke shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. That's a lie. This woman's word against mine. Sit down, Mr. Fallon. Judge Baker commanded. You're not on trial here. Not yet, someone in the crowd muttered. Loud enough to carry? When order was restored, Lila was recalled to the stand. This time, she spoke not just about the fire, but about the pattern of harassment, the economic stranglehold Duke tried to maintain on the town, the fear that kept good people silent. Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing, she said, her eyes sweeping the room. It's about choosing what kind of community we want to be. Do we want to live under the thumb of any man who has money and guns, or do we want law that protects everyone equally? Wentworth made a final attempt to discredit her, bringing up her race, her past, the circumstances of her marriage. Lila weathered each attack with quiet dignity. You seem to think my background makes me less credible, she finally said. But I've learned that truth sounds the same no matter who speaks it. And the truth is, Jake Morrison burned our barn on Duke Fallon's orders, and everyone in this room knows it. The jury, 6 men from the community, retired to deliberate. The wait was agony. The courtroom thick with unspoken tensions. When they returned after only 30 minutes, Caleb reached for Lila's hand. We find the defendant guilty of arson, the foreman announced. The room erupted in cheers and curses. Jake Morrison slumped in his chair while Duke stormed out, his threats barely audible over the noise. Judge Baker sentenced Jake to 5 years in territorial prison, the maximum allowed. As people filed out, many stopped to shake Caleb and Lila's hands. Some who had shunned them before now offered awkward congratulations. The wall of prejudice hadn't fallen, but it had cracked significantly. Outside the courthouse, Duke Fallon stood with his remaining men. His eyes found Lila across the crowd, and his message was clear: this wasn't over. That evening, the soup kitchen was fuller than ever. People brought food to share, turning it into an impromptu celebration. But Lila and Caleb remained watchful, knowing Duke wouldn't accept this defeat quietly. "You were magnificent," Caleb told her as they served beans to a line of neighbors. "The way you stood up there, told the truth despite everything they threw at you." "Truth is easy," Lila replied. "It's lies that take effort to maintain." Near the end of the evening, a stranger approached a well-dressed black man from Cheyenne who introduced himself as Isaiah Reed. "I heard about your testimony, Mrs. Hart," he said quietly. "I'm a legal clerk for the territorial government. There are some documents you should know about contracts Duke Fallon has been using that may not be entirely legal. If you're interested in pursuing this further." Lila and Caleb exchanged glances. Taking on Duke in court over Jake was one thing. Challenging his entire business empire was another level of danger entirely. "We're interested," Lila said firmly. "Very interested." As they walked home under a canopy of stars, Caleb asked, "Are you sure about this? Duke's dangerous when he's cornered?" "He's dangerous regardless," Lila pointed out. "At least this way. We're fighting back with law instead of bullets. Both might be necessary before this is over. Then we'd better be ready for both." They reached their homestead as the moon rose full and bright. The new barn stood sturdy against the sky, a testament to community support and their own refusal to be broken. Inside their home, they prepared for what was coming, checking weapons, securing windows, but also reviewing the documents Isaiah had given them. "Duke's been using these contracts to keep people in virtual bondage," Lila said, reading by lamplight. "Not just me, dozens of others. If we can prove they're illegal, we'd free a lot of people," Caleb finished, "and make Duke more dangerous than ever." They looked at each other across the table, understanding passing between them without words. They'd come too far to turn back now. What had started as a forced marriage born of debt had become something neither expected: a partnership that might just be strong enough to bring justice to Sweetwater. Outside, a coyote howled at the moon, and the wind carried the sound across the prairie like a promise of trials to come. Spring arrived in Wyoming like a hesitant visitor, bringing tentative green shoots through the melting snow. The new barn stood proud against the brightening sky, its fresh lumber golden in the morning sun. Caleb and Lila worked side by side, preparing the soil for planting, their movements synchronized from months of partnership. The soup kitchen had evolved into something more, a weekly community gathering where neighbors shared food, news, and increasingly, hope. Lila had started teaching letters to anyone who wanted to learn, using charcoal on flatboards when paper was scarce. On Sunday afternoons, the chapel's back room filled with the sounds of children and adults alike struggling through their first written words. "See here," Lila said patiently to young Martha Weatherby, guiding the girl's hand. "The letter A stands tall like a little house. Try again." Caleb watched from the doorway, marveling at how natural Lila was with the children. Some of the women who'd initially shunned her now brought their little ones eagerly, pride overcoming prejudice as they watched their children learn. That afternoon, Caleb worked on the irrigation channel, following the slope from the creek to their planted fields. The work was backbreaking, digging through rocky soil, placing boards just so but necessary. Water was life in this dry land. "It's running!" he shouted when the first trickle made its way down the channel. The water was muddy and slow, but it was flowing. Lila ran from the house, and they stood together watching their first small victory over the unforgiving landscape. "We'll have beans and squash by summer," she said, her face bright with possibility. "And corn," Caleb added, "maybe even enough to sell some." That evening, they made the journey to Cheyenne with Isaiah Reed. The Territorial Records Office was a dusty warren of filing cabinets and ledgers, but Isaiah navigated it like a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. "Here," he said finally, pulling out a yellowed document. "This is the template Duke's been using for his contracts. Notice anything unusual?" Lila studied it carefully, her finger tracing the dense legal language. "This seal," she said suddenly. "It's not official, and the witnessing signature that's supposed to be a territorial officer, not just any notary." "Exactly." Isaiah's smile was grim. "Every contract Duke's forced people to sign in the last 5 years is potentially invalid, including yours. They spent hours copying documents, building their case. As night fell, they found lodging at a respectable boarding house. The proprietress, Mrs. Chen, didn't even blink at their mixed-race marriage. Cheyenne was more cosmopolitan than Sweetwater, with its railroad workers and traveling merchants from all backgrounds. Over dinner, Caleb and Lila discussed their future with a freedom they'd never felt before. "When this is over," Caleb said, "when Duke's hold is broken, what do you want?" Lila considered carefully. "That garden we talked about. Maybe expand the teaching, real school supplies, proper books, and—" She hesitated, then continued boldly, "maybe a child, to raise free, without fear." Caleb reached across the table to take her hand. "I'd like that, all of it." The look they shared was full of promise, but tempered by the knowledge of what still lay ahead. On the ride back to Sweetwater, they were ambushed at Devil's Canyon. 4 riders emerged from the red rocks, bandanas covering their faces, but Caleb recognized Duke's foreman, Hank Sullivan, by his distinctive pearl-handled pistols. "End of the line. Hart." Sullivan called out, "Mr. Fallon sends his regards." But they'd prepared for this possibility. Lila had the shotgun across her lap under a blanket, and Caleb had practiced quick draws until his hand was raw. When Sullivan reached for his weapon, Lila fired through the blanket, the blast catching his horse and sending it rearing. Caleb drew and fired in one motion, his bullet catching another rider's shoulder. The ambushers scattered, not expecting resistance. One tried to circle behind them, but Lila was already reloading, her movements calm despite the chaos. "The rocks!" Caleb shouted, spurring their horses toward cover. They made it to a defensible position among the boulders, trading shots with the remaining attackers. Lila's father had taught her well. She squeezed off shots with careful precision, making each one count. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, the attackers retreated, Sullivan cursing as he clutched his leg where buckshot had found its mark. "This ain't over," he shouted as they rode off. "No," Lila agreed quietly, checking Caleb for injuries. "But we're still standing." Back in Sweetwater, word of the ambush spread quickly. Sheriff Watson, faced with mounting pressure from the community, actually formed a posse to pursue the attackers. They didn't find them. Duke's men knew the territory too well, but the effort itself was significant. The next Sunday, Reverend Thompson surprised everyone with his sermon. Taking his text from the book of Amos, he spoke about justice rolling down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. "We have allowed fear to make us small," he said, his old voice gaining strength. "We have let one man's gold outweigh our neighbor's suffering. But justice delayed is not justice denied if we act now." After the service, he publicly presented Lila with a gift, a real slate board for her teaching, paid for by collection from the congregation. It was a small thing, but the symbolism was enormous. The church itself was acknowledging her work, her worth. That afternoon, the community gathering was larger than ever. People brought not just food, but commitments to watch each other's properties, to stand witness if needed, to resist Duke's intimidation together. Ben Wheeler had news from town. Duke's credit's drying up. Merchants in Cheyenne won't extend him anymore. Word is he owes big to some dangerous people back east. A desperate man is a dangerous man, Mrs. Garrett observed. Then we'd better be ready, Caleb said. They spent the next weeks fortifying not just their property but their legal case. More people came forward with stories of Duke's exploitation. Anna, the saloon girl who'd testified, revealed that she too was held by one of Duke's contracts. Others followed, a trickle becoming a flood. One evening, as Lila transcribed yet another statement, she paused. You know what we're really doing here. What's that? Caleb asked, looking up from cleaning his rifle. We're not just fighting Duke. We're building something new. A place where contracts mean what they say. Where law protects everyone. Where people like us can just live. He moved to stand behind her chair, his hands on her shoulders. Sounds like a place worth fighting for. She leaned back against him. Worth risking everything for... Outside, spring thunder rumbled across the prairie, promising rain for their newly planted fields. The irrigation channel was ready. The seeds were in the ground. And despite everything, or perhaps because of it, hope was growing alongside the crops. They'd started as strangers bound by debt and desperation. Now they stood as partners in every sense, ready to face whatever storm Duke Fallon was preparing to unleash. The bonds between them had been tested by fire, strengthened by shared struggle, and tempered by growing love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in their small home that smelled of fresh bread and gun oil, of seed packets and legal documents, they had each other in the beginning of a dream neither had dared imagine when autumn's wind had first blown them together. The red dawn broke over the canyon like spilled blood across parchment. Duke Fallon's hired guns had arrived in the night, taking positions in the rocks above the Hart homestead. The warning bells Caleb and Lila had strung chimed frantically in the morning breeze. 12 riders, maybe more, Caleb reported, peering through the rifle slot they'd cut in the shutters. His shoulder still ached from the ambush, but his hands were steady on the Winchester. Lila finished loading the shotgun, her movements precise and calm. Ben's signal fire is lit. Help will come. They'd prepared for this cached ammunition, reinforced windows, water barrels inside in case of siege. But knowing Duke's desperation had reached this point still sent ice through their veins. The first shots cracked across the morning air, splintering wood from their door frame. Caleb returned fire, picking his targets carefully. They couldn't match Duke's numbers, but they could make every shot count. Hart, Duke's voice carried across the distance. This is your last chance. Sign over your land and leave the territory. Take your woman and go. The only thing I'm signing is your arrest warrant. Duke, Caleb shouted back. More gunfire erupted. Lila coordinated their defense with military precision: when to shoot, when to reload, where to watch. She'd divided their ammunition into sections, rationing it like she'd rationed food during the blizzard. Southwest corner, she called out, spotting movement. Caleb swung his rifle and fired, sending a gunman scrambling back behind cover. A bullet punched through the wall inches from Lila's head, showering her with splinters. She didn't flinch, just shifted position and sent buckshot toward the shooter's hiding spot. Then Ben Wheeler arrived, not alone but with Sheriff Watson and a full posse. The sight of the law riding to their defense instead of Duke's shocked everyone, including Duke's men. Duke Fallon, Sheriff Watson's voice boomed across the battlefield. You're under arrest for conspiracy, arson, and attempted murder. Tell your men to throw down their weapons. The gunfire intensified instead. Duke's men, realizing they were now fighting the law itself, began to panic. Some fled immediately, spurring their horses toward the territorial border. In the chaos, Duke himself broke from cover, making for the canyon's narrow entrance. But Lila had anticipated this. She stepped out from the house, shotgun steady. Stop right there, Mr. Fallon! Duke wheeled his horse to face her, his own pistol rising. For a moment, Time seemed to freeze the black woman he'd tried to own, standing firm against the man who'd terrorized a town. "You think you've won?" Duke snarled. "You think this changes anything? There'll always be men like me, and women like you will always—" "Will always what?" Lila interrupted, her voice carrying clearly. "We'll always survive. We'll always fight back. We'll always prove men like you wrong." Caleb appeared beside her, rifle trained on Duke, behind them. More of the community emerged: Tom Weatherby, Mrs. Garrett, even Reverend Thompson with an ancient fowling piece. "It's over, Duke," Sheriff Watson called out, finally finding his courage. "Your contracts are void. Your men are scattered. Your empire is dust." Duke's face contorted with rage. He started to raise his pistol toward Lila, but three things happened simultaneously. Caleb stepped in front of his wife. Lila's shotgun boomed, and Sheriff Watson's rifle cracked. Duke's pistol flew from his hand as buckshot peppered the ground at his horse's feet. The animal reared, dumping Duke unceremoniously in the dirt. He lay there, clutching his shoulder where Watson's bullet had found its mark, wounded but alive. "Bind him," Watson ordered his deputies. "Careful now, even a snake can bite when it's wounded." As Duke was led away in irons, he passed close to Lila. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Yes," she replied quietly. "It is. You just don't know it yet." The battle's aftermath revealed the scope of their victory. 3 of Duke's men were captured, 2 wounded, the rest fled. Among the captured was Hank Sullivan, whose testimony would prove crucial in the coming trial. Isaiah Reed arrived from Cheyenne that afternoon with a territorial judge and a stack of documents. "Every one of Duke's contracts has been declared null and void," he announced to the gathered crowd. "Anyone held under these false documents is free." The celebration that followed was subdued, but heartfelt. At the Red Butte Saloon, now under new management since Duke's arrest, former employees burned their contracts in the stove. Anna wept openly as her paper turned to ash. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most. Mrs. Morrison from the general store approached Lila with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said simply, "for how I treated you. You showed more courage than any of us." That evening, as Caleb and Lila tended each other's wounds, they allowed themselves to truly believe it was over. Duke would face trial in Cheyenne, far from his influence. His wealth, built on exploitation, would go to compensate his victims. "We did it," Caleb said wonderingly. "We all did it," Lila corrected. "That's the only way it works together." A week later, Duke's trial began in Cheyenne. The courtroom was packed with his former victims, all ready to testify. Duke, diminished without his guns and gold, looked like what he'd always been, a small man who'd used fear to seem large. Lila testified last, her words measured and powerful. She spoke not of revenge but of justice, not of hatred but of hope. When she finished, the courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's pen. The verdict was never in doubt. Duke Fallon was sentenced to 20 years hard labor. As they led him away, he looked back once at Lila and Caleb. What he saw there, strength, love, triumph, made him drop his gaze and shuffle away in defeat. On the ride back to Sweetwater, Caleb and Lila stopped at the canyon where they'd been ambushed. The red rocks glowed in the setting sun, but the shadows held no fear now. "Feels different," Caleb observed. "We're different," Lila replied. "All of us." They returned to find their homestead transformed. Neighbors had come while they were gone, finishing the irrigation system, planting extra crops, even starting construction on a small schoolhouse addition. "For the teacher," Ben Wheeler explained, grinning. "Figured you'd need a proper place for all the students you'll have now." That night, as they lay in bed listening to the peaceful sounds of the prairie, Lila voiced what they'd both been thinking. "It really is over, isn't it? The fear, the running, the fighting." "That part is," Caleb agreed. "Now comes the building part, the living part." "I like the sound of that." They made love gently, mindful of healing wounds but unable to deny the joy of survival, of victory, of a future suddenly bright with possibility. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead. The same stars that had witnessed their forced beginning, but now they shone on something transformed, a love tested by fire, a community forged in struggle, a justice that flowed like water through a land too long parched. The territorial newspapers would report the facts: a corrupt businessman brought down, illegal contracts voided, a town freed from tyranny, but the deeper truth was written in smaller moments in the books Lila would teach children to read. In the crops Caleb would grow on land truly theirs, in the life they would build together on the foundation of their unlikely love. Duke Fallon had forced them together with cruelty and greed. In defeating him, they'd discovered something he could never understand, that love grown in hardship, watered with sacrifice, intended with respect, could bloom stronger than any force that tried to crush it. The dawn would bring new challenges, but they would face them as they'd learned to face everything together, unafraid and free. Summer 1890 spread across the Wyoming prairie like a benediction. The grassland rolled in green waves, dotted with wildflowers that hadn't bloomed this abundantly in years. At the Hart homestead, the irrigation channels ran clear and steady, feeding rows of thriving beans, squash, and corn. Lila stood in the doorway of the new schoolhouse addition, watching children from across the county practice their letters. The room smelled of fresh pine and chalk dust, with real glass windows letting in streams of morning light. 8 children sat at makeshift desks, their faces white, Mexican, black, and mixed, bent in concentration. "Remember," she said gently, "every letter you write is a door you're opening. Take your time." The transformation of Sweetwater had been gradual but undeniable. With Duke Fallon's influence removed, the town breathed easier. The Red Butte Saloon now operated as an honest establishment, run by Anna and 2 other women who'd gained their freedom. The general store prices were fair, and Sheriff Watson, finally free to do his job properly, kept actual peace. At the chapel, Reverend Thompson prepared for an unusual ceremony. The old minister had aged visibly during the Troubles, but his eyes were bright as he polished the simple wooden cross. "Second wedding for the same couple," he mused to his wife. "Can't say I've done many of those."
"This one's different,"
she replied, arranging wildflowers in mason jars. "This one's by choice." The idea had been Caleb's, voiced one evening as they'd sat watching fireflies dance over their flourishing fields. "I want to marry you proper," he'd said. "Not because of debts or threats, but because I choose you, because I love you, because I can't imagine any life but this one we've built." Lila had cried then. The first tears Caleb had seen from her since the night of the fire. Yes, was all she'd managed. But it was enough. Now the day had arrived. The chapel was full not just with the faithful, but with the entire community that had fought alongside them. Ben Wheeler stood as Caleb's best man, his blacksmith's hands scrubbed clean. Mrs. Garrett, tears already streaming, stood with Lila. When the doors opened and Lila entered, wearing a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, adorned with prairie roses from their garden, a collective sigh rose from the congregation. She walked alone. She needed no one to give her away. She was giving herself freely and joyfully. Caleb waited at the altar, his face showing every emotion: love, pride, wonder, and a joy so deep it seemed to illuminate him from within. When their eyes met, the rest of the world faded away. Reverend Thompson's voice was strong as he began. "Dearly beloved, we gather today not to create a union, but to celebrate one that has been tested by fire and proven true." This time, when they spoke their vows, each word carried the weight of experience. They promised not just to love, but to stand together against whatever storms might come. They promised not just fidelity, but partnership. They promised not just to have and to hold, but to build and to grow. Caleb Hart," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Take you, Lila Brooks Hart, to be my wife. You came into my life when I deserved it least and needed it most. You showed me that a man's worth isn't in the cards he's dealt, but in how he plays them. With you, I've won more than I ever dreamed possible. Lila Brooks Hart, she replied, her voice clear and strong. Take you, Caleb Hart, to be my husband. You gave me shelter when I needed it, respect when the world offered none, and love when I'd forgotten how to hope for it. With you, I've found not just a home, but a purpose worth fighting for. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife again, the chapel erupted in cheers. This time, their kiss was neither hesitant nor careful, but full of promise and passion earned through trial. The celebration that followed filled the town square. Tables groaned under the weight of shared food. Fiddle music spilled into the evening air. Children of all colors played together while their parents danced, the artificial barriers that Duke had reinforced crumbling like walls whose foundation had been removed. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Caleb stood to address the gathering. The talking and laughter stilled. "A year ago," he began, "I lost a bet. It was the luckiest loss of my life." He found Lila's eyes in the crowd. They said I was forced to wed a black beauty. They were wrong about the forced part. My heart made that choice the moment I saw her strength. But they were right about one thing. I did discover the wife of my dreams. He raised his glass. To second chances, to the courage to fight for what's right, to the community that stands together, and to my wife, who taught me that love isn't about what you're dealt, it's about what you build together. The toast was drunk with enthusiasm, but it was Lila who had the last word. Standing beside her husband, she looked out at the faces, some who'd been hostile, many who'd been indifferent, all now part of something larger. "When I came to Sweetwater," she said, "I was running from one kind of bondage. I found another, but I also found something I never expected people willing to change, to grow, to fight for justice, even when it cost them. I found a home not just in a house, but in a community. And I found a love that turned what started as a devil's bargain into a blessing beyond measure." She paused, her hand finding Caleb's. "They say the West is hard. They're right. But it's also a place where people can remake themselves, where the past doesn't have to define the future, where love can grow in the most unlikely soil. Thank you all for proving that true." The applause that followed echoed across the prairie, carrying with it the sound of a community transformed. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Caleb and Lila slipped away to their homestead. They stood on their porch, looking out at their land, the green fields, the sturdy barn, the new schoolhouse, the well that now drew sweet water. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, his arm around her waist. "About that boy," Lila said softly. "Tom Weatherby's nephew, the one who lost his parents to fever. He needs a home." Caleb smiled. "I was thinking the same thing. Might be nice to have young feet running around here. Might be nice to give him what we found, a second chance, a real family." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. In the distance, they could hear the faint sounds of the ongoing celebration, but here in their own space, peace reigned. The telegram from Cheyenne had arrived that morning. Duke Fallon had died in prison, killed in a fight with another inmate who wouldn't bow to his demands. It was an ending, but not the one that mattered. What mattered was what they'd built in his absence, as they prepared for bed in the house that had sheltered their transformation. Lila touched the wooden frame Caleb had made that first winter, their initials carved with hope when hope was scarce. "No regrets?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Only one," Caleb replied, pulling her close. "That it took losing everything to find the only thing worth having. They made love with the tenderness of absolute trust, the passion of hard-won joy, the certainty of a future they would face together. Outside, the prairie wind sang its ancient song, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like freedom, like possibility, like home. In the morning, they would wake to the crows of their rooster, the tasks of their thriving homestead, the voices of children learning to read, the greetings of neighbors who'd become family. They would work their land, teach their students, raise the boy who needed them, and continue building the community they'd helped to free. But tonight, in the quiet of their room, they were simply Caleb and Lila Hart, two people who'd been forced together by the worst of circumstances and had chosen to create the best of lives. Their love story would be told in Sweetwater for generations, though the details would shift with each telling. What would remain constant was the heart of it, that love, when tested by fire and watered with courage, could transform not just two lives, but an entire community. The West had made them, broken them, and remade them stronger. And in the end, the cowboy who'd lost a bet had indeed discovered the wife of his dreams, not because he was forced to, but because when fate threw them together, they chose to hold on and never let go. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, courage, and redemption in the Old West. I hope Caleb and Lila's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Where are you listening from today? Please comment below and let's connect across the miles, just like the communities in our story came together. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about this tale. What part resonated with you most? Your comments and support mean the world to us. Until next time, partners.